Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Dan, the voice behind ThatKaitoDan, and welcome to my analysis for the RWBY World of Remnant, all about the Great War. Before we begin, just a reminder, as ever, that this video may contain spoilers for the show, so watch at your own risk. And a small notice as well before we get started, RWBY Grim Eclipse has now released its console versions for both Xbox One and PS4, including one bundle with the Team Juniper DLC, and there's even some themes released for each member of Team RWBY, and a Grim-inspired one too that you can grab. Check the digital store to grab your copy, and I hope you enjoy it. So it looks like we've reached the final World of Remnant for the volume, and what a doozy too. Not only is it the longest World of Remnant we've had, just beating the Four Maidens one, but it's a topic that a lot of us have wanted ever since it was first mentioned, the Great War. So enough build up, let's dive in and see what Crow has in store for us this time. And yes, it was Crow still at the narrator helm, despite his current situation in the main show. Makes sense as these are a separate beast from the show's recent events. So, the Great War. The worst battle that the World of Remnant has ever seen. 10 years long, and with about a century's worth of tension and conflict leading up to it. Most of it caused by the Kingdom of Mistral. In this time before the schools were formed, the Emperor of Mistral had already done a solid job in conquering most of Anima, snatching it out of the hold of the Grim. A lot of this came with some interesting assistance from their neighbours in the north, Mantle. Mistral would provide goods to Mantle that they wouldn't be able to obtain given their harsh frozen land, and in turn, Mantle would trade some of their technological boons, as well as offer some guidance and support to help the Emperor gain control over Anima's frozen north. Who better to help with that issue than the pros when it comes to not letting the cold bother them anyway, right? And in all fairness, this is a pretty logical partnership to make, and clearly it had its positives, until the alliance became something a little bit more negative. Apparently there was some kind of incident in Mantle that would lead to a drastic decree, the abolishment of the arts and self-expression, which we know became a large deal in the upcoming conflict that many would argue against, according to Ozpin during his Volume 2 speech. This plan had the intent of controlling the people's emotions so no negativity would feed the Grim. I can kinda see their reasoning, but surely being unable to express yourself and use your creative skills would lead to its own negative emotions, unless Mantle was really extremely imposing on the control. Also, what could have happened to spark this incident? It had to be something tied to the arts for it to be the target of the decree, so what could it be? What if it's tied to the strained relationship between the capital Mantle and the people who broke off of it to form the livelihood in Alcius, that would later become the new capital, Atlas? Perhaps someone's large, expressive outbursts could have led to a huge riot between both parties, tempting the Grim to get involved thanks to the negativity spawned from this, and thus the higher-ups, including the King of Mantle, would have brought down the ban to temper the emotions. It makes me wonder now if perhaps Weiss, who's set to leave Atlas, could end up at Mantle, and given she's a notable singer, she could bring her expressive talent to help fix some of the broken bonds between Mantle and Atlas, akin to the good work across the world that her grandfather Nicholas made. Back on topic, and given Mistral is the cornerstone of the world's major expressive and creative arts, many would have thought that Mantle's decree would have led to Mistral dissolving their alliance to maintain their way of life. Except that wasn't meant to be. The Emperor actually ended up accepting Mantle's wishes, but only to the lives outside of the capital, letting those better off inside the capital to maintain their way of life and freedom, basically confirming the higher-ups of Mistral to be major douche canoes. It didn't make Vale's opinion on this alliance lighten up either, the folks here feeling not too fond of the two M-named kingdoms using slave labor, as well as poorly mistreating their citizens and their mindset that their way of life is superior. More fuel was added to the fire though when Mistral opted for expanding their grasp in Remnant, this time in the eastern side of Sanus, on their islands and peninsulas, just as settlers from Vale were starting to do the same thing. So naturally, disagreement sparked. It's here that we're introduced to the King of Vale, who right off the bat, given some of his design elements and the fact that he has a cane on hand, definitely gives off some Ozpin vibes, despite the whole Fabio hairstyle. The king was constantly bombarded with cries from his people to drive off these invading numbers, but he tried his best to avoid any kind of fighting, and even seeing a compromise of the land being shared by both parties, only for something to kickstart the first fight of the war, though no one knows who shot first. My vote is Han. But seriously, it could have been either a Veil face or a Mistral face, or heck, it could have been a third party looking to set off the chain of events to follow. Now who could be so devious as to doing that? Yeah, I wouldn't be shocked if RWBY pulls a Fullmetal Alchemist here, this time with Salem to blame if this conflict between her and Ozpin was a thing even this long ago. And so the fighting began. Veil versus Mistral and Mantle, who would join in to aid their allies. This would begin the first true fight of the war, with clashes emerging all across Anima and Sanus as well. As for Vacuo, they were advised to stay out of the fights by Mantle and Mistral due to both kingdoms having settlements in Vacuo around this time, so long as they didn't back up their neighbouring kingdom. At least that's the agreement at first. Soon enough, Mistral and Mantle tried to stronghold the Vacuo kingdom into siding with them. That ended up being a mistake though, as the faunus looking leader of Vacuo opposed such a plan, the belief being that if Veil would fall, there would be no one left to aid Vacuo should they be the next target. The desert-based kingdom managed to drive out Mantle and Mistral numbers on their land, with a style that Crow himself personally approves of. And now the sides were truly formed. Vacuo joined their neighbours Veil to face the alliance of Mistral and Mantle. The Great War had truly begun. The war raged on across the world, even on the future menagerie and the Dragonland it seems given the map. It also sadly brought in a brutal wave of Grim across the world too. What better negative fuel to feast on than the kind brought by a worldwide war? It was such a large-scale issue that it even forced a temporary ceasefire from all sides on the battlefield to quell the swarm of Grim before returning to the war zone. This war brought another downside as well. With the very best fighters from all sides in the war, it left those left behind at home lacking in strong defenses from the incoming charge of Grim, resulting in lives lost on the battlefield and at home, as well as leaving Remnant in a truly dark period of time, where many died, settlements were lost to time, and rations were put on place for dust and food. It did have some positives, mind you. Humans and faunus were fighting together, and they ended up making strong bonds because of this, and technology progress continued, though most of it was to aid in the armies. The war lasted for 10 years, until finally, the climax, during the Vacuo campaign. Mantle and Mistral sought an end with a powerful body blow to their enemy's resources, aiming for control of the dust mines held in Vacuo. Unfortunately for them, they met the King of Veil, who had finally had enough, joining the fray himself, garbed in his crown, wielding his sword and scepter, and he decimated the entire enemy forces in a single-hand attack. And now we get to one of the biggest areas of discussion following this world of Remnant, the King of Veil, as well as his powers and some ties to some current day characters. Let's start with Ozpin. The former headmaster said that he helped build Mistral's Huntsman Academy, and we later hear that the King of Veil would spark the creation of the school system. So it's reasonable to believe that the King and Ozpin are connected. The best bet being that the King would later connect his soul to another in the same process that would eventually become the current day Ozpin before he did the same thing with Oscar. Both guys have a notable cane on them, led at the helm of Veil, and the King's single-handed wiping out of the enemy forces could give identity to Ozpin's previous comments about making more mistakes than any man, woman or child, remembering the events of the war thanks to the soul connection. Past act that the King likely regretted given his previous attempts to try and avoid any conflict. Not only that, but he could have used a relic to aid his fight, if one of them is indeed stored in Ozpin's cane as many have predicted. only here could have been housed inside the king's scepter. There was mentions of mysterious weather patterns during the fight that many do believe was actually a key factor that the king benefited from, but it could have actually been manifested by whatever power a relic can offer. Another possible avenue is perhaps the king is also the wizard. Crow does quip that legends were made of the great and terrible warrior king, which was also a notable description that the wizard dubbed himself in the live-action Wizard of Oz film. He could have used his magic to turn the tide, and if there was any seasonal maidens involved, the belief that the king managed this feat alone would seem a bit hollow if he indeed did have backup from the weather-powered females. I don't know. There's purposely a lot of mystery over the king's power and what truly happened in this final blow, so we won't know fully until some greater insight is provided. However, that's not the only interesting side to the king. There's also his sword and his crown. It's intriguing to note that for the first time in a world of Remnant, someone's weapon isn't the same color as their silhouette. The king, even right down to the scepter, is colored in green, while his crown and his sword are colored in a golden yellow tint. The crown being this color could just be to add more of a royal touch to the king's silhouette, but for the sword, it could mean something more, especially when a certain Jean Arc's sword is noted as a very important weapon, and its name, Crochet Moors, means yellow death. A key sword named the same color as the king's sword. It can't be a coincidence, right? Many are now speculating that Jean and the king have some connection because of this, but it's a theory that I see two sides to. For starters, the design of the sword is different, the king's being a one-sided blade, while Crochet Moors is two-sided. Not only that, but there's no son of the accompanying shield. If this is the same sword, then perhaps over time, each wield of the sword could have added to it, to where it would eventually not only have the shield with the emblem of the arcs upon it, but also the change to the blade to make it a two-sided weapon. And we have actually seen this process happen in the current age, when Jean got his upgrades, so it could actually just end up being a tradition. Then of course, there's the question of, is Jean a descendant of the king? Which I'm not too sure of. Jean himself has said many before him in his family were heroes, and the sword came from his great-great-grandfather, who used it in the very same war. If he's knowledgeable about the sword's history and the history of his family, how does he not know that he's possibly related to royalty? Plus, if Ozpin was once the king, that would make him, in some strange way, related to Jean. Though it would admittedly explain why he kept the boy on board at Beacon despite cheating his way into the academy. It's why I personally feel that Jean's family isn't related by blood to the king, but they could be related by the sword. History time. The real-life Crochet Moors belonged to Julius Caesar, who was also able to wipe the floor with his enemies with the weapon. One time though, he actually lost the sword to an enemy prince when it got stuck in his shield, and the prince was equally successful with the weapon himself. What I imagine is possibly the great-great-grandfather of Jean acquired the sword from the king, either as a gift or perhaps even stealing it. The sword would then be passed down and even gain in a scabbard in the form of the shield, thus the sword and the shield connection. This could also serve as the connection between Jean and Ozpin, the headmaster perhaps recognizing the sword thanks to the memories he had as the king, and thus began his interest in the boy, seeing if he can achieve success himself with it, perhaps one day living up to such of a legend as a king. Any of this could also explain why Tyrion is interested in the lad too. If Salem's battle with Ozpin was a thing even during the age of the king, then she and her followers may be aware of the sword's legend. There's also one last debate about the sword, as well as the scepter and the crown. All three items could serve as future hosts of the relics. Thinking on which one could serve as which, you could have the crown be the host of knowledge, which makes sense given it's a headwear piece, and the sword working for destruction, as the lone weapon that has a destructive past to it. The questions then would be, what relic would the scepter have, and what other item could be the remaining host? There's no other item of the king's that has a major highlight, so it could very well be that it's something else entirely that he doesn't carry on his person. Again, more mystery without a big wave of possible solid hints, but again, it is still early days regarding the relics, and there's plenty to chew on in this world of Remnant already. So yes, the King of Vale became a legendary warrior king in the eyes of many after his impressive victory in Vacuo. Even with those claiming it was more to the fact of the unnatural weather or the enemy's unfamiliarity with the Vacuo desert environment, many that day saw the warrior king as the most fitting leader for not just his kingdom, but for Remnant as a whole, the other leaders willingly or begrudgingly bowing at his feet. Yet the king did not take on the role of leading the world. Instead, he and the other leaders would meet on the island of Vital to form a treaty that we know would go into the creation of the Vital Festival. Alongside this, the governments got a restructure to better accommodate the new relationship, and many territories that were captured or lost during the war were redistributed, likely including the island of Menagerie that was then given to the Faunus after slave labour was ceased as well. The King of Vale, as said before, would then help form the Huntsman School system, with the after effects of the war and the final deadly clash forming a massive influx of Grimm, so the world needed to prepare itself, with the King's four most trusted allies helming each of the new academies. Wouldn't be unfair to assume that these four would also be the first to be trusted with guarding their respective relics kept within the academy buildings, as per the King's request, who then decided that he would be the last King of Vale, I imagine wanting to reflect on the actions that he made and the lives that he took. And thus, the Great War finally met its end. The world started to rebuild itself, with the kingdom's academies training the world's future defenders, so that they could all fight alongside one another, rather than against each other. Though with Salem's current actions, it might not be long until the kingdoms are once again at each other's throats. And that's it for the analysis. Overall, it's a definitely strong topic to close on, and it more than delivered in my opinion, for the first glimpse into one of the biggest events in the world's history. I would hope to see more to do with the war in due time, but for now, I'm quite satisfied, and it wrapped up Volume 4's World of Remnants quite nicely. But of course, that's just my general opinion. What about you guys? Was there enough information to please you, or did you hope for more? Let me know in the comments down below, and why not share what topics you would like to see in the next line of World of Remnants. While you're at it, be sure to like and think the video if you wish to, and hit the subscribe and bell buttons to make sure that you get new uploads from me as they drop. Plus, definitely follow me on Twitter at ThatKaitoDan, as I share a lot when it comes to RWBY, as well as leave updates on future videos and more. But until next time though, have a good day or good night, and peace out.